Good evening, and I dare say we're a cozy little group. So without further ado, I'm going to start talking about books, specifically books for an age group that we've started calling young adults now, and writers of young adult books who also write other books as well. Some years ago, I wrote a couple of young adult books myself, and at that point in time, I remember when my would-be publishers came back and said, we think this is a great young adult book or book for young adults. I thought, you know, I've never thought of myself as a YA writer. I thought of myself as a writer or maybe a storyteller. So I remember being a little uncomfortable with this YA tag. Now, how would you describe yourselves? Are you writers? Are you YA writers? Are you storytellers? Are you advocates? I mean, Anjana, we'll start with you and then Merete.
Okay, I would describe myself as a writer and a storyteller. And I think anything else that gets into the stories and the writing just comes because I think if you're being true to what you're doing, certain things come in. So that's about what I would have to say.
Yeah, I think also I will consider myself a writer, writing for children or young adults, though it is something I do in between other books. So it's also a way of relaxing. In the sense, it's not that it's easier, it's just maybe less, I don't know, maybe I drag less on my own experiences or something. It's a more playful.
It's more playful.
Yeah, and that's really nice sometimes, yeah.
Or a change of flavor, sort of, so to speak.
Yeah.
Now, for all of us who either teach, or I know Merete, you have, Anjana, you have occasionally. Shrikot here, some of our members of the audience have too. One of the things we have noticed is that the ubiquity of the handheld phone has altered, in many ways, what we considered immersive. So there was a time when the paper book was the most immersive thing for some children who like to read. And for children who didn't like to read, there were lots of other things that were immersive. There were sports, they were watching sports on TV, there were films, all of that. Now, this one device has altered our lives in multiple ways, and it has altered storytelling, both for readers and writers. So, how has your writing changed? Has it changed at all? Have you seen a difference in the behavior of your young readers as a result of the phone?
Not really, because I don't know, I don't talk to my smartphone very often, unfortunately. And I tend to believe that people who like reading, children who like reading, will continue to read. Yes, I have 3 nephews and a niece who are sort of smartphone friendly, but of them, 3 of them are actually readers, and I don't think I had too much to do with that. That was something that was there. So I'm hoping that despite the smartphones and everything else, the children who like reading will read. And there is, of course, I don't know. There was a story in the Telegraph a while back about a cafe in Shantiniketan where they were offering people free coffee if they would sit for an hour with a book. So I guess it's not just children, it's adults actually. So it's a phenomenon which one needs to tackle. And I hope it will be tackled. I think it is actually in a way.
Are readers reading differently because of technology, Merete?
Yeah, well, I think for me, I have taken it as a challenge to, instead of saying children or young adults should read on paper, say, well, if you like to read on your mobile phone or your tablet, let me create literature for you to read on the phone or the tablet. I wish I could show it to you here, because I made some different apps, both for smartphone and for tablets, which are literary stories, working with interactivity or different ways of reading. Because I think that for me, paper is just, I said that also before, paper is just a form. It's not content. The words are the content, the story is the content. The book is just a couple of 100 years old. Literature is much, much older. And I think it's interesting to try and meet the young people where they are, and they are, as you say, on the smartphone. So to write stories on the smartphone and to have them develop stories on the smartphone is really interesting for me.
So what you're saying is storytelling is evolving and books are one medium, and reading itself is split into reading on paper or reading on the phone, or you can consume a story by listening or by experientially even contributing to the story, which we are seeing more and more of. It's just that publishing hasn't yet adapted to this kind of interesting behavior. Perhaps someday. But tell us a little more about your work, Anjana. I know your latest book that is out is not a YA book, but you've worked for many years in conservation, and you have a range of books on that, and I'd really like you to tell us about it.
Conservation is actually, I don't know if I worked on it. It's something that came about quite accidentally, because I and a friend were in Nainital and we were talking about ghosts one cool winter night. And if you're going to talk about ghosts in Nainital, the most famous ghost is Jim Corbett's ghost. So she said, okay, you write, why don't you write a story on Jim Corbett's ghost? And for some reason, well, I don't know, I kind of thought that was an interesting idea. What were the man whose ghost incidentally has been seen in Almora and various places as red lights and blue lights, God knows what. Anyway, it's supposed to be his ghost. What would he do? And having thought it through, I thought he would probably be into big cat conservation. So I evolved this series. Well, I didn't know it was going to be a series. These series of stories of leopards and tigers in distress, because of conflict with people, the normal situations that come up. A tiger is running off with goats, a tiger has got out of the core area of a national park and is threatening a village. And how do you resolve it without getting people eaten up or without getting the tiger killed? One has to try and, okay, again, I don't know if I really thought it through, but it came out that what I was writing was perhaps a way of how these things should be resolved. Because I was writing for children, I brought in the ghost, and I brought in a little boy, not a little boy again, a young adult, I guess, called Rohan, who was generally in trouble with his maths homework. And together they faced the problems of trying to get big cats out of a situation. And somehow the other, I think children seem to like this one. Possibly because ghosts and big cats go together. And also you've got things like villages in distress, stray cows, how you take a cow to graze by twisting its tail, and all these other funny details that I didn't know I even knew. But because I was writing it, it came out. And again, so I guess.
It's, I wish we could hear a little more about your book or hear you read bits of it, but I understand you've forgotten it to bring your book. So I
I
find
don't lug my books along. Well, I thought about it. I said no.
But Merete, I see you have your young adult. Is Nora?
No, Nora is not the young adult, but I would like to talk about
I'd love to
my,
hear
my
more. Yeah, your
ideas with it, because it was a little special. When I was very young, I read a book in school, and it was about a girl who came into trouble with drugs. And it was a very good story. And she went through all these problems with the drugs, and she came out on the other side. And it made a huge impression on me. Later in life, my family was very problematic, and I went to live alone when I was young, 15 years. And I was surrounded by many people who did a lot of drugs, but I never did it myself. And I think this book had an influence on my thinking about why I didn't do it. Then I was asked, after I published several books and I got well known in Denmark, I was asked by a publishing house who publishes for young adults to write a novel for them. And I thought, I will write a novel on the same theme, because if I could make just one person not take drugs reading my novel, that would be, a success. So I wrote this novel, and it's being read in schools, and I'm very happy for that, because it's I think it makes a difference. And it's about this young girl, and she lives in a family. They're a very nice family, but they have divorced, and both her parents have new families. So even though they're like upper class and they have time for their children, she's like somewhere falling in between the families. And so she has this hole, if you may say, that she's trying to find out what to do, and is being tempted by people who do drugs, and she has like a journey with it, but she also comes out on the other side more wise, and I think the young readers will think that she's like saved. And I think it's something to do with writing for young adults, that I will always write a nice ending. You know, I will always wrap it up. So I'm not, because with adults sometimes I can make a very harsh ending. So, but with the young adults, I want to wrap them up so they leave the book with a feeling of having some empowerment or some knowledge that they can go on their life with.
That's interesting, because my next question to both of you would have been, is there anything, any issue, any topic, any way of treating a young adult story or a children's story that you would consider off limits? So what is off limits for Merete? What is off limits for Anjana Di as a writer for this age group?
You want me to? Well, I think that there's no topic that's off limit. Like, you can write about death, or you can also write about sexuality or problems with your parents. But you do it, I do it, and I think you have to do it in a different way, in a more positive and lightful way, playful way. So you can present problems, but to me it has to be educational or pedagogical, in the sense that you give some kind of a road for the reader to walk on out of the story. And there was a children's book in Denmark that treated the concentration camps in Germany in the Second World War. And I ended up not liking the story, because it was really, really hard. It was just telling things as they are. And some people think maybe you should do that, but I think you need to somehow, I don't know, give some hope or give some lightness when you read for a younger audience.
Yes, I agree with that, because children need hope, and you actually need to guide them through things. And if you show them the world as it is, they can see it anywhere on the television or even on their iPads and smartphones, because you've got the internet and WhatsApp and everything. So for them, things have to be told in a certain way, while being as true to your topic as possible, and hopefully, well, not hopefully, ending it so that it is happiness, so that there is a possibility of things being better, and that they can somehow contribute to making things better.
This is really interesting because, just as I was asking this, now as I was formulating this question, I was thinking of sort of the same thing, that no topic is necessarily off limit, but perhaps what is off limits is cynicism. Because when you're so young and when there's anyway life around you, and a lot of stories are very dystopian, but you're after all talking to people who've just started their lives out. And I think as writers, perhaps the one responsibility we have is not so much the topic, but keeping the hope alive.
Yeah, I really agree.
Even if it is a tragedy, even if it is, ostensibly a sad ending, what you cannot kill is hope. You can kill off the main character, that's fine, but yeah. Off late, I have noticed, walking into bookstores and you stand discreetly and you watch human behavior for a while, and I see an awful lot of adults, and I'm one of those adults, but I see an awful lot of other adults as well, buying young adult books, not for their children, but for themselves. And that's very interesting because, for those of you who may not have the topic up there, it's called, our session is titled, Young Adult Stories, How the Fables Have Turned. And I wanted to, ask you if you notice this pattern in bookstores when you visit or among adults that you know, and why you think adults might be reaching out for books that we call young adults. Is there such a thing as a young adult in anything other than heart? That's the other thing. I mean, I'm a perpetual young adult at heart. I suspect you are too. But, do you see this trend of perfectly adult, ostensibly people, or even middle-aged people, picking up books meant for a far younger cohort?
But yes, of course, I've seen that. My theory is that it's that hope in the young adult books that they like reading, because adult literature can be so grim, and life is grim anyway, I think. So it's a way of going back to something you used to know, to something which is showing you the world as it might be. Perhaps there's a chance. And incidentally, along the way, you might get a very entertaining story which may or may not have anything to do with reality.
Merete, your view?
Yeah, I don't know if I have noticed. What I noticed was my son read this Philip Pullman series, which is now a series on Netflix. He's 26. He's doing a PhD in literature.
I'm a huge fan myself, and I'm 47.
And he said, "Oh, mother, you have to watch this." I never read the books, and I've been watching it, and I'm like, "But this is not for grown-ups." I call him, and then I said, "He's 26." But it's not for grown-ups. He said, oh yeah. And honestly, I don't understand it because to me, it's nice, but I think it is a wonder world, And but maybe a lot of people need that wonder world because, as you say, the world is grim and tragic, and I more noticed when I'm flying, because I'm flying a lot, that a lot of people are watching cartoons. Grown-ups are watching cartoons in the airplane, and I always wonder about that also, so there is a trend. For me, it's just a little strange.
Sometimes I wonder if the general dystopia and the worldwide depression and the recession has something to do with it, because the last big depression we had in the US, that is when the great musical comedies kind of, they just took off. And of course, in books, you can't have musical comedies, and we don't have a Noel Coward, but we do have, fantastic young adult books coming out. And I think a part of the psychology behind reaching out for that book is somewhere you know that this is one genre where there will always be hope preserved.
Yeah.
And you just know that is a given.
Yeah.
So yeah, in times of when hope is in question, you reach out for that book.
But it's interesting, back to flying. I was flying and I watched a new film, I'm not sure it's out in the cinemas yet, about J.R. Tolkien and his life. And I think the books of J.R. Tolkien, which are I always considered them like a fantasy. He's the first one to really write fantasy and this world of monsters and the good against evil, but we know always the good will win. But watching this film about his life, I realized that what he has written was a way of, making a metamorphosis of his experiences in the First World War. I didn't know that. And that was really an eye-opener to me, that he has taken this extremely hard reality for himself, which killed his best friends, destroyed other friends' mental health, and turned it into this amazing story where we always know that good will end. Good will win, the
Yes.
good will in the end.
Whatever the price, good will
Whatever
win.
the price.
Yeah.
And I think that it was just such an eye-opener to me.
Sometimes I do feel that writers have that wonderful quality, writers and storytellers, of being in the darkest of times, knowing that it is the darkest of times, and bringing out the best distilled version of hope for everybody that they can bring out. And I think, books don't sell as much as we'd like them to. Nobody makes much money. But the bigger picture is that, that is what everybody tries to do. And if you do a good job at it, halfway decent job, it's a fabulous description of a life.
Yeah.
But coming back to the topic, a lot of stories for children, at least growing up in India and reading a certain kind of English books and a certain kind of Bengali books. In Bengal, we had a very, very rich body of work for children and young adults. As I grew up, however, I found gender biases, caste biases, class biases, things that, a lot of things that I would not use as narratives today or to pass on to the next generation. I would want a new set of fables and fairy tales. And as a writer of today for the next generation, what are your essential treatments? What is your ideal fairy tale, your ideal fable? How would you, what's your list? What's your list of do's? Not don'ts so much, but what's your list of do's?
Okay, I think actually that probably my conservation books are somewhere on the borderline of fairy tale, because if you have a ghost prowling through them, you can't say they're reality.
Right.
But I've tried to put it together so that with the little boy Rohan, there is a girl called Manjul who lives in the village. She can jump trees, she takes the cows grazing, and she occasionally has encounters with tigers. And the point is, Rohan's mother doesn't quite approve of this little girl who comes into their bungalow and squats on the floor. But somehow or the other, I thought it was a good pairing, because I thought children need perhaps to know that there are other children from other backgrounds who can do different things perhaps, but who have the same hopes and who have their own ways of dealing with situations which more privileged children need to find out about. Again, I'm not saying I did this consciously, but I think while I was writing it seemed to be something I wanted to do.
Merete?
Yeah, I think that what I try to is also like to examine myself, the things I write, the concepts I want to explore. Are they biased in some way by my upbringing, by the culture I'm in, by prejudice about men or women, girls or boys? So always examining what am I writing, what am I thinking, to make it more lively. But then, it's funny because sometimes I was in another panel in Denmark, and somebody said, "Oh yeah, but there haven't been so many female writers." And I sat thinking, and I realized that when I was a child, I read so many female writers, like Laura Ingalls Wilder, you may read here also, Enid Blyton, Astrid Lindgren, and in Denmark we have many more. So it's, but because they are writing for children or young adults, it's like they are not considered. I don't know, but I did so many female writers gives us the books that we read early on, and I think that's important because it does give a broad perspective on life.
Yes, I mean it's ironical, isn't it? Agatha Christie being Agatha Christie, best-selling writer of all time, and because she was a woman, she was always considered a frivolous detective story writer. And she sold nearly as much as the Bible.
and she's an amazing
she was
amazing writer,
amazing storyteller. But you know, these things are par for the course. But I was thinking,
my daughter is called Agatha, so for me she has had a great influence.
Oh, that's fantastic! Because I am a huge fan. I think being a woman and choosing storytelling, you cannot ignore her influence. You just cannot. But Merete, you have an app for one of your children's stories and characters.
Yeah, I have.
Tell us about.
Yeah, I have made several apps. I don't know. I mean, it's probably difficult to show, but what.
If you have an Apple phone, if you're on iOS, it's very easy to download.
It's called WU Woo and Company, and it's on iTunes Store, App Store. And so what we did is I wrote a story together with a programmer and illustrator. So the three of us worked together from the beginning. So it was not that the programming was put on top of the story or the story on top of the programming. So what we did was we made this app where you read something and then you you read like this and you take up the phone and then it's 3D so you can move around and you get the characters, strange beings. They come and they each have a story. So you need to read and then again take it up and you will be in their world, and you have little things you need to solve, little puzzles. But the reading, the story, the narrative is the core of the app. So the children are getting a literary experience and at the same time playing and having fun. And it's also, you can choose to have it read aloud or to read it yourself or that the parent reads it. So it has different modes. And it's in English, not in Bengali or Hindi, but it is in English.
But with the potential to be multilingual at some point in time?
It's in English, French, and Danish. But of course, I mean, if somebody wanted, it would be easy. It's not a long text. It would be easy to take it into other Indian languages as well, definitely.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So what is your latest work? I know your new book is not for young adults, but it sounds like a fabulous romp. And Merete, I want to know about your latest book as well.
Okay, my latest book is called Conspiracy of Aunts. And it's about these two aunts who find their ex-nephew-in-law very useful. They're forever running to him for things. And they're very upset because their niece has divorced him. And they know that their niece is still in love with him. He is still in love with her, but he's got another wife. So they hatch up a plot to get rid of their nephew's wife and make him their nephew-in-law again. So that is basically the story.
Modern fairy tale, you would call it.
I could call it a modern fairy tale, and I will say this, that my nephews who have dutifully sat through tigers sat up and said, thank goodness, for once you're not writing about tigers.
It sounds funny. Well, my latest book is this book I brought with me here. It's called Nora, and unfortunately it's only in Danish, but it's a very rare thing. It was something I was asked to do, which is really rare for a novel. But in Scandinavia, we have a big playwright called Ibsen, and he wrote a play called A Doll's House. which is very famous. It was published in 1879, and the main character, Nora, she leaves her husband. And so there was a big thing in Norway, and they wanted me to write this novel, so I did. And what I did was I took Nora as a historical person and wrote her life from when she was a child until the time of the play. So it's it's maybe a very literary thing, but I have a historical education, and I like to try to bring life into time past. So it's been really a pleasure writing this book.
It's very interesting because Satyajit Ray, the Bengali filmmaker, he did an adaptation of Ibsen's Doll's House. Yeah. Some years ago. Yeah. And I'm sure people here would be delighted to know more. Yeah. But is there an English translation, or will there be one soon?
We can hope.
We can hope.
Yeah.
We can hope. I've had a fantastic time talking to these two phenomenal writers and women. If there are any questions from you, we have mics available. I can see one hand up there. I don't mind giving my mic. Just take mine.
Yeah. Thank you. This was really fascinating, almost like listening to a story. So I really enjoyed it. I had a couple of questions. One is, I, in addition to writing, I also teach creative writing. And one thing I notice among young writers is this almost really significant obsession with fantasy and magic. And I think we all like fantasy and magic. I think it's really, really wonderful. And yet I sometimes kind of feel like they're missing out on this wonderful real world we live in. And especially, for people, in high school or college living in Indian cities, it's an incredible experience. And, in my work as Josh and Anjana, you'd know that I'm very rooted to cities, locations, and I wonder why this sense of missing out on the real. And I can see that because so much of their entertainment is from the digital world. They're coming out of a diet of Harry Potter or Tolkien, which is wonderful. But I also look back and think that, even when we loved reading fantasy and magic, I think when it was most interesting was when it was actually melted into the real. Like, I'm thinking someone like Roald Dahl, who is magical and it's real. At the same time, I think your conservation books, are like that. There's a sense of place. Or even looking at, Bangla writers like Leela Majumdar or, Satyajit Ray, there is always the real and the fantastic together. So there is a sense of enjoyment of the real. And I wonder, why we are kind of, I wouldn't say entirely, but there's a sense of depletion of the real, which I think is a bit of a loss. I wonder what you thought of that.
I have a feeling that this is because people are always looking for a world that is better. A world where you can get the better of the villain, or where a vampire who lives forever will lose his heart to a human being, or where you have these superheroes that take on dark forces and win against all odds. And some of them are set against historical backgrounds, simply because I think people are kind of, at one level, very bored with the world that they see every day. It is the writer's choice as to whether he does fantasy or not. It is the readers to decide which world he or she wants to inhabit. So therefore you have a Harry Potter which is Enid Blyton gone magical. It's a school story with magic. So that is real and unreal.
You can have all those things in the real world, can't you? I mean, you can have all those stories set in the real world.
You can, but you have a choice. The werewolf stuff is very popular because of the worlds it inhabits. It gives you free reign over the imagination. You can range wildly. You can't do that with the real world because somewhere or the other you'll have to stop. You can throw in a witch, you can throw in a ghost, you can throw in magic, yes.
But,
well,
I would second that with one more point though. When we were children, I don't think we were monitored so much. We were not monitored on what we read, what age we were when we read it, how we played, with whom we played, how long we played. Play dates weren't set up for us. It was not such a very, very controlled world. So we did not, I think, feel the need to escape so much. I think children nowadays, because they're monitored so much, they've just escaped into fantasy as a way of reading. That's just my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, but even that time, I remember the Narnia books were just coming out, and I was in London then. So it's not that the fantasy worlds did not exist. Narnia, for example, is a telling of a Christian myth in certain ways. Yes, I agree with her that now in a monitored world, people like all these Marvel comics, they like superheroes, they love vampires, but they've always loved vampires. Ever since Bram Stoker brought out Dracula, the vampires has been a runaway success. And now you have romantic vampires. So you can just curl up with a book or an app and let your imagination go, and hopefully your mother isn't there to say, excuse me, you have a unit test tomorrow? Have you finished?
Yeah, no, but I'm thinking the other side of it when the young people write themselves, that I would never allow them to write fantasy, because it's if you're doing a course, of course, when they're themselves, they can do what they want, but teaching, because it's somehow a little easy. It's somehow, not that Harry Potter or Narnia are not very, very good books, but when they write themselves, it's like it's easy for them to go off into a fantasy world where it's much more difficult when they need to write about reality. So if I'm teaching, they need to write something very concrete, because it teaches them a lot. Then maybe later in they can create their own world, but I think it's, when they write, it's because it's easy, yeah.
I think I agree with you, because I think, a really good fantasy work requires so much world building. Thinking of Tolkien and Harry Potter are obvious examples. It's like you're giving up a readily available world and you're going to create a new world. So that requires so much work. And a lot of young people I see, people in college, they're not really willing to put in that world.
No.
So the result is you get something very abstract, and you can't really connect to it. Yeah. And I'm like, why are you living out this wonderful sensory concrete world that is there? And I completely agree with you what Joshua was saying, that it's
and also, as you say, like a Harry Potter, it's when you go through it, it's consistent.
Yeah.
And it's that consistency that often lacks when people start writing.
But one of the reasons why they do it for young people writing for themselves is it gives them free rein. They can just write what they like. Whereas if they look at the world around them, their imagination sometimes gets, I think, a bit stuck. So that is why most of them get into fancy. Like most people start off by writing poetry, because poetry has no bounds. You can do what you like. So in the same way, if you're writing a story, well, fantasy has no bounds, actually.
This is a fabulous discussion again on the question. Any other questions? Well, if not, then thank you. You have been very, very meaningful to us with your attention and your thought-provoking question. We hope we've been half as good to you as you have.
Thank you.
Thank you.